And welcome back to the Cover 3 podcast here on CBS Sports. That's Bud Elliott. That's Bill Connelly, ESPN's own friend of the show, back once again for what is becoming one of several annual, semi-annual, check-ins here on the Cover 3 podcast. We've got a ton to get to. You have just released tons of data for college football fans everywhere. In fact, I saw one college football fan remark that this is a checkpoint of the offseason when we get in 1 week the returning production rankings and also the first SP Plus rankings for 2022. So we're going to get into those plus a lot of other things. So I want to begin, Bill, with how are you feeling having finally unearthed all this data? I saw you were checking like players' Twitter feeds to try to keep up with all the transfers and everything. Our former co-host Barton Simmons, who's now general manager at Vanderbilt, we've been talking to him. He says like the transfer portal is crazy. So for you to try to keep track of this from a personnel tracking perspective, does it feel good to at least finally have this project for this point is done and out into the world?
Yeah, the combination of, the portal part is not that bad just because, there are services out there who record who's in the portal and you can very easily hit refresh and find out. Can't think of what company does that, but there are good products for that. So that's fine. As long as they show up in that thing, that part's easy enough. The hardest part this year, it was hard last year. It was like 4 times harder this year, was which seniors are coming back next year. Because on like draft declaration lists, it was going to primarily be the redshirt sophomores and juniors, not these seniors who could have come back but didn't. And so you didn't really have that to lean on. Only like 50 of 131 teams have released rosters for 2022 so far. And at least one of those, Indiana, purported to be 2022. It was just a duplicate of 2021. So at least one of those was incorrect as well. So yeah, a lot of times I had a list of seniors and it was searching, first name, last name, team name, Twitter in Google and finding their account and trying to piece together through the billions of retweets they make for, all their friends getting offers or announcing that they were in the transfer portal or whatever. It was a rougher process this year than it's ever been. And I guess if it's harder for me, I'm not going to, it's better for the players and all that. Like, it's fine. But this was a bigger pain in the butt. And I don't feel like I was just amazingly accurate with it either. It was just the best stab possible.
So, Bill, yesterday you dropped returning production. Today you dropped the new SP Plus ratings. I want to start with returning production, and you can weave the SP Plus ratings in kind of as you wish. I want to talk some different methodology questions here with you as far as what you find has value with returning production and how you go about gathering it, as Chip just asked. A couple things. So obviously you have different weightings for offense and defense. You have more position specific numbers for offense. And then because defense is more nebulous, as you wrote in the piece, as far as positionality, it's more just pure production. I know you're a big exclude garbage time guy with a lot of your numbers that control for opponent quality and game state. With returning production, are you able to do that, or is that just kind of a step too far with the granularity?
Well, I think I could do that, but it comes down to what are you trying to measure? Is it literally just experience levels, like how many snaps have you had on the field, versus more the players who were involved last year, who for whatever good a team did, how much of that good, the important stuff, returns for this year? That would be the garbage time thing. Like if a freshman offensive lineman got snaps, who cares? You're up 40. It's more important who was responsible for going up 40. In the end, I've gone the former route, just the pure, for offensive line. You got 38 snaps last year, even if they were in garbage time, that makes you more experienced than you would have been if you haven't gotten 38 snaps. And so I've just gone with the raw snap. It's certainly easier as well, but even beyond that, I think the theory behind it, I want to measure experience more than who did the good things and who's coming back. That ended up being the route I chose.
Wouldn't coaches probably back that up too? When coaches in the conference only schedule of the pandemic 2020 season, one of the things that they were one of the things they pointed to was in missing some of those non-conference games.
Right.
they wanted to see their freshmen in garbage time because they associate some value, even if it is a garbage time snap, to being able to get out there. It seems like, I mean, just anecdotally off the top of my head, seems like the coach would agree with you that all snaps are valuable snaps when it comes to experience.
Right. And I mean, from a nerd standpoint, you can really question, like, what do you really learn in 17 snaps against, Stetson or whatever, as compared to what you learn every day in practice and all that. Maybe it really doesn't have much value, but that's the direction I chose to go. I feel like there's enough value there that should be the point behind measuring returning production, even though both have pretty good arguments.
All right, let's do some myth busting here. So broadcasts are going to tell you offensive line and defensive line experience, especially offensive line continuity,
right?
How much it matters. It's hard for me to sort of divorce myself from that idea because I do think it kind of matters because it's really more of a teamwork position maybe than some other positions are. But Bill, your research indicates that is not necessarily the most important spots to have that returning experience at.
Yeah, it's breaking it out by unit on offense. It ends up being like approximately the returning production formula for offense ends up being approximately like 29% quarterback, 6% running back, 37% receiver, tight end, and then 28% line. So now that I have snap counts, that was something I didn't have a few years ago. I was using, career starts and whatnot. And that wasn't great. That resulted in offensive line not really carrying that much weight in the formula because I just didn't have a good way to measure it. Now that I have snap counts, the percentage has gone up a whole bunch, and it's from like 10%, it's up to 28% now. There are a couple different ways to look at that. Number one, like that's a lot on the passing game for sure. Passing game continuity matters the world. But at the same time, when you divide it by like the number of players we're talking about, 6% for running backs, that's one guy at any one time. Obviously, it's more than just the starter, but usually only one running back's on the field. So 6% kind of makes sense there. You divide the 37% for receivers by like 4, and it ends up being 8-9% or something as opposed to 6%. So it's a little more valuable, but not a ton. And you end up getting about 6% per lineman as well. So really, it's like quarterbacks up here. And then like receivers, tight ends, offensive linemen, running back are all pretty close together.
Have you seen in this, in pulling everything together, obviously last year, a big topic of the conversation was that the returning of production was higher than ever before. Right. Were there any other sort of big picture national trends that you were seeing, whether it's starting to cool or maintain? Because our coaches keep telling us, as long as all these extra years of eligibility are in the ecosystem, the numbers are messed up and creating some real problems for some programs across the country.
Yeah, I mean, last year what we found was, when I look at the averages for, if you return 80% of your production in a given year, you're usually, you're going to improve by X amount. That wasn't the case last year, in part because like half of freaking FBS returned 80% of their production, or, whatever. I put the numbers in the piece. It was like 6 teams from 2014 to 20 had returned, what was it, like 85% or something, and it was like 20 something this year or last year that did it. So basically,
Louisiana at like 91 or something.
Right, Louisiana, UCLA, Wyoming was really high, and so those teams.
Damn Pac-12 brought back
Pac-12. That's right. Which
congratulations.
Pac-12 didn't improve even slightly last year. So basically, any advantages you might get from that were significantly negated by the fact that everybody else had those same advantages. Now, if you lost guys, if you had like Northwestern was at 37% or something last year, that's always going to be bad, and that's always going to be very foreboding. But their SP Plus rating ended up dropping like 3 touchdowns last year because they were the only ones that were that inexperienced overall. And you could quite clearly see it on the field. And even, just the teams at the bottom of the list, most of them did regress, aside from Tennessee and South Carolina, both getting sparks from new coaches and whatnot. That ended up the bottom end very much held true when it came to, if you don't clear this certain mark, then you're probably going to regress. At the high end, it was a lot harder. It was a lot less likely that you were going to improve dramatically just because everybody else was returning a ton as well.
A couple more here on. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we're going to go around to conference by conference. Yeah, sorry.
Well, I have 2 more on methodology. One comes from our audience, actually. So you can follow us on Twitter at Cover3 Podcast. And they wanted to know, is there any weight given to when the production came in the
Right.
season? The specific example was basically like, hey, what if a young guy played quite a bit, played well later in the season? Are you able to actually track that with this?
No, sample size is always going to be the enemy of something like this because there are always going to be teams. Actually, I was going to. I'll talk about Cameron Rising, for instance, in a second. But there are always going to be teams that win like 4 of their last 5 games, and with a bunch of sophomores who are then going to return the next year. And in theory, that seems pretty sustainable if you improved with guys who will be back and had a reason for needing to improve and all that other stuff. It's really, really hard from a number standpoint to make anything out of 4 games. It's hard to make anything out of 12 games if we're being honest, but it's really hard to know what's real in that case. Now, a case of an injury or, a Sam Darnold, Cameron Rising situation where they just started the season with the wrong guy. And so like Utah, let's see, Utah returns. Do I have that spreadsheet pulled up? This is always the best part of podcasting with spreadsheets. Utah returns at the quarterback position because they lost Charlie Brewer. They return 80% of their passing yards. Like really, if I'm going team to team and making manual adjustments, I should probably change that to 100% because they're returning 100% of the passing yards that actually ended up mattering for them last season. But that ends up being kind of that and like Boston College with the quarterback injuries. Like I'll go back through. And for the big injuries, over the next few months, for the big injuries, I'll go in and put in their 2020 stats instead, which for Pac-12 teams isn't going to make a damn bit of difference, I guess. But because it's still only going to be 4 games or whatever. But I try to account for it in that way. It wasn't possible in January, so I'll make a lot more manual adjustments as we go.
I know you wrote in your SP Plus piece about how you're using transfer ratings in the recruiting formula and sort of slowly easing it in as we figure out just how good these ratings are. I mean, we have a decent feel for in the aggregate, how good recruiting rankings are, which by the way, check our YouTube page. I just shot a video of that. Do you know that 4 and 5 stars are 23 of the 44 starters in the Super Bowl, despite being only about 8% of the entire scholarship player pool in college football? That's a pretty good number there.
We're not going to have the low-hanging fruit columns of this guy was a no-star and now he's in the Super Bowl. So therefore,
it's Cooper Kupp.
There.
Yeah. Oh my God,
that's true. Yeah, never mind.
A million Cooper Kupp.
Never mind.
Yeah,
it shows how much I don't read about the Super Bowl until about the Thursday before the Super Bowl.
I could see it coming. I've been working on this for like 3 weeks. Okay. Cooper Kupp is going to be the story. Also, everybody else was a blue chip. So hypothetically here.
Yeah.
If you had a quarterback who was in like an air raid style offense and threw for 1 million yards and he transferred to Wisconsin, a team that doesn't throw the ball all that much.
Yeah.
He's coming from a real high volume offense. He's going to a very low volume offense. Do you, I know in the piece you said you just jam the numbers in there.
Yeah.
Do you make any account for volume?
That's another thing that I might do with the manual adjustments later. But at the same time, I'm not worried about an air raid guy going to Wisconsin. Like it's such a low probability. And even with Caleb Williams, if that had happened, he's only sort of air raid and he had only thrown for like 2,000 yards because he only played half the year. So that still wouldn't have really mattered. But yeah, I mean, there are certain like manual adjustments that would improve the process. That would be one of them if or when it happened. And back when I was counting FCS stats, we had a couple air raid, like super prolific Eastern Washington type guys go to, Vernon Adams going to Oregon and the kid who ended up at Washington, but not playing a couple years ago, Kevin Thompson from Sacramento State, I think. I plugged his numbers in and I mean, there was like, wow, Washington's now, going to be loaded at quarterback next year. And obviously there's a reason I don't count FCS numbers now as a general rule. But even beyond that, I mean, there are going to be some examples where you can kind of rig the system with a very prolific guy who isn't going to match those numbers, but it just doesn't happen very much. Those guys don't go to Iowa and Wisconsin and so forth. So it's not a problem I actually have to address, even if it's a whole overall.
You want to take a little spin?
Tom's not here today.
Oh yeah.
We should start with the ACC, man.
We don't have our checks and balances to be able to. Well, then, so in the like the ACC right now is in a fascinating position because we have just seen for the first time since 2014 someone not named Clemson, and for the first time since all the way back to Virginia Tech, right? That we didn't have a Clemson or Florida State here in this position.
Oh, geez, yeah.
Like we are, has blood been drawn? Because I look at the ACC Atlantic and what NC State was able to do, not just last year, but even the previous season. We see what Wake Forest has been able to do under Dave Clawson in terms of establishing some stability in your returning production rankings. Mike Norvell's Florida State Seminoles, 11th in the country. Louisville trying to get a little bit of a bounce back, 14th in the country. I wonder if we are going to be looking at a year that is like a get right for Clemson, or if we are seeing some of these other teams within that division really starting to see what we've seen with Alabama in the SEC, which is like, if your pace setter is up here and everyone else truly is charged and motivated to catch the pace setter,
right,
eventually all of those resources are going to pay off in being able to put yourself in a position to do it. So what do you make of let's start with, what do you make of the ACC Atlantic, where it definitely looks like some of these teams are loading up trying to chase the champs?
Yeah, the most boring thing about the SP Plus projections overall is basically when a power falls a little bit, like it just basically says, yeah, they're fine. It'll be fine. They're going to be right back to where they were last year. And Clemson, sure enough, is projected 5th overall, because even though recent history isn't a massive piece of it, they were perfect almost before 2021, and their defense was still really good. And so I was kind of curious where the ACC projections would land, and I was hoping it'd be a big fat mess. But you've got Clemson at 5th. Then you got Pittsburgh and NC State at 13 and 15. You got Miami at 20, FSU at 24, and Louisville at 29, I guess. That's pretty much that's pretty boring. that's pretty straightforward overall, and it's not a lot of fun to talk about. I was actually very curious about NC State though. I even tweeted out the other day once I saw that if returning production, basically the projected change you get from returning production, if all I did for SP Plus projections was take that, apply that projected change to last year's total, where would they land? Like NC State would have been 4th overall if you just looked at last year in returning production. There's a reason I don't do that, because NC State would have been 4th, and that doesn't quite feel right. And so you apply recruiting and all these other things. I didn't realize that like the recruiting average I've got for NC State, which is a lot last year, and a lot of NC State fans have already mentioned, like, we only signed 12 guys. Well, I look at both raw point totals and average recruiting, and I look at the 3 years before that as well, and to a certain degree, and they're still like barely top 50 in the way I measure the recruiting averages. So that dragged them down a lot, and it put them only at 15th. And if I'm personally ranking these teams, I'd probably put them more in that 9 to 12 area, I think, just because, a lot of the recruiting rankings, you're looking at defensive line talent means a ton. It's really hard to get really good line talent without really good recruiting rankings. I think they've got it. And so I would give the same way with Baylor to a certain degree. I would give them a little bit more faith, but that does serve as kind of a reminder that NC State's kind of new to being really, really good, and those teams don't always keep it up.
And hasn't SP Plus hated NC State at times? Like, isn't that one of the teams that even as the wins have stacked up, like each week you release the new batch and you're just flooded by Wolfpack fans? Your name is mentioned in Raleigh, North Carolina on the radio a lot. And especially this week, it has been mentioned a lot. You are known. You are well known among the NC State fan base.
That's interesting. I don't get a lot of Raleigh radio requests. That's,
Well, Joe Ovius and Joe Giglio owe it.
Oh, yeah. Okay, Joe does. Sometimes. I think a lot of that comes from them being 54th while going 8-4 in 2020. That was the main. I'm looking through the rankings. Actually, when they won 9 games in 17 and 18, they were 24th and 35th. So it doesn't dislike NC State. It doesn't love them. But then last year they were 14th. It was legit, especially on the defensive side of the ball. The offense was still conservative, and
Bud hates it. But
yeah,
I want to drive this bus.
Yeah.
I was all over NC State last year, man. Yep. I was like, they were like probably the first. Like, I'm gonna be on this over win total before the win totals were even a thing.
Right.
Probably back, and then they got there, but they were also, if you look at Jared Lee's numbers, they were worst in the entire Power 5 in win probability added for fourth down decisions.
Well, if you're going to have your hand in the dirt, you can't be going all willy-nilly, going for it on fourth down. Hand in the dirt means we punt in plus territory.
Well, and it's funny, too, because they passed a lot. That's the weirdest part about this. Isn't, well, like a Northwestern, I guess, who, only wants to run the ball but can't. Like, they couldn't run the ball, but they didn't really try all that much. Donovan Knight and Ricky Person didn't even have 150 carries, either one of them. And so when you pass a lot and you pass reasonably well, that should make you more confident in those situations. And it really was a poor game management situation. It felt like, anyway. It didn't really, I was about to say it didn't really cost them. I guess they did lose 2 of their 3 games by a combined 4 points. So it could have very much cost them, and it might continue to. But yeah, no, it's, I don't want to pretend this is a top 5 team, but the line, the defense, the line talent, it feels like they've got a lot going for them, even though they're obviously losing a really, really, really good offensive lineman.
The split with the Atlantic to the Coastal is really wild to me this year. You have the least experienced team in the Atlantic, right? Chip mentioned a bunch of them. Cuse is also 15th, Wake's 46th, and you get Sam Hartman back. In the Coastal, you have Georgia Tech 109th in returning experience, UVA 123rd, and then Duke 125th. The Coastal champ might be 7-1 in the league.
Yeah,
because you can beat up on the bottom.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Whereas the Atlantic, 6-2 probably gets you the Atlantic this year, and maybe outright, given how many teams are projected to be top 20 or top 40 level.
Right. Yeah, and obviously a lot of that'll depend on Clemson and if they really do kind of click back into place. But it's kind of a, not that it's weird that the Coastal champ could be from a lesser pool than the Atlantic, but you're right. If one team particularly stands out, whether it's Pitt or, a Miami or whoever.
But that's it. Who else would you add? That's the only thing.
Whatever is what else I would add. I kind of caught myself there. No, it's, if they really do kind of stand out, if Pitt really is the 13th best team in the country, obviously they're in very, very good shape overall, at least until the ACC finally actually gets rid of divisions, which would be lovely because that is kind of sad overall. Let's see. I'm trying to think what else I have to say about the ACC as a whole. Duke, by the way, like near the bottom of returning production for 2 straight years. That's the way you get projected 117th overall. Like it's bad news. They are very, very, very much starting from scratch.
Yeah. What we have we said Virginia Tech and Virginia over under combined 4.5 ACC wins, and the advantages were that A, they play each other, and B, they both play Georgia Tech and Duke.
Yeah. That's a good cushion right there.
Okay. So oftentimes we see some of the best teams in the country, some of the top programs in the country, and the blue bloods, they end up lower on the returning production. Why? Right. Because they've got studs that are going to the NFL.
Yep.
Ohio State checks in at number 24.
That shocked me.
And so I want to ask about the Buckeyes. And then in particular, it seems like it's more on the defensive side of the ball which when you add in the context of bringing in one of the top defensive coordinators from last season, kind of a bit scary for the rest of the Big Ten.
Yeah, assuming I had it all, laid out right, they do lose a couple of defensive linemen that were really good. Really, they were solid. They weren't great up front, obviously, last year. But they do get thinned out a little bit there. Returning production formula doesn't really care about the defensive line. That was one of the biggest shocks when I was just generally running correlations, trying to figure out the weights to apply to everything. Maybe it's just because the teams with the best defensive lines, like I was talking about with recruiting, maybe it's just that they always have the best defensive lines and therefore it doesn't end up mattering all that much in that regard. But being that returning production doesn't really care all that much about the line, in fact, they return the top 4 linebackers, it looks like, top 5 defensive backs, plus Tanner McAllister from Oklahoma State. Obviously when they struggled last year, they got shoved around, and there's nothing, they have to prove that that's not going to happen again. Because again, that's where their attrition is here. But it's easy to assume that the defense will be good enough to not get in the way of what should be another incredible offense.
Bill, is an offensive SP plus preseason rating of 48 the highest you can remember in the preseason?
Let's see. Based on the new let me see how quickly I can pull this based on the new formula, like the new weights and everything. Looking back over time. Oh no, wait, I don't have that easily available. Never mind. It's high.
That jumped out to me as like,
it's stupid high. And that was the case. That was why, Ohio State was second in SP plus last year. It's not like it liked their defense all that much, although it only had them in the 20s, I think. But their offense was so far ahead of everyone else's at 47.2. Like the defense didn't really matter. It just assumed they would figure it out. And for the most part, they did. They just, they blew a couple red zone chances against Oregon. And of course the Michigan game got away from them at the end. So they're still a very good football team. And if the defense improves, then what's not to like?
There's a real chance they just score. They just outscore everybody this year. I mean, they if you're a full touchdown better projected offensively than the 5th rated team, that's kind of like back to what we were seeing with that Joe Burrow team for a little while.
And it was funny. I mean, with we could be talking any other team, we'd be talking about like, well, they lose, Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave. That's a big deal. But I remember joking before the Rose Bowl. I'm like, well, I guess that means Smith and Jigba just has to catch 300 yards worth of passes, and then he did.
Yeah.
And so like if he's going to be that great, not that he's going to average 300 yards a game, but if he's going to really be like the best receiver or very close to it in the country, and then they have like 38 other former 5-star receivers to choose from, like 2 of them are going to come through, and that it's just impossible to even pretend to worry about the receiving core.
So what did your numbers tell you about Michigan, and what does your head tell you about Michigan? Because applying context to looking at this team into 2022 makes these, and number 4 in SP plus, in the how do you look at Michigan, and how do you consider the Wolverines given their current state on the field, but then also on the sidelines?
Right. Ignoring the context of everything that's happened since their season ended. The fact that, their offense took a big step forward last year and now returns, quarterback, I guess not Haskins, but plenty of talent at running back, like basically all the receivers, good portion of the offensive line. Plus they added the Virginia kid, the center, Oluwatimi. It seems like further improvement is all but guaranteed there on offense, and on defense they lose a ton and should regress a little bit. I think it has them projected down to 19th now, to fall from 10th. So offense gets a little better, defense gets a little worse, and you've got a potential top 5 team again. Obviously, when you add the context, not just the Harbaugh nearly left thing. I mean, that's whatever. Teams, Michael Leach,
McDonald. I mean, like all of
right. Like that part matters more to me than Harbaugh almost.
Correct.
Like Michael Leach almost left Washington State a million times, and they just kept getting a little better each year. But so that part doesn't matter. But you add, the offensive coordinator who finally kind of got things moving forward just left. And the defensive coordinator
lit things on fire on the way out.
Right. I can't stay here. They don't care about me. And then, the D coordinator leaving for the NFL, that makes a little more sense, obviously. But no, it took a lot of hires to get that kind of that thing, get the ship righted in Michigan. And now you just lost your 2 most important hires. That's, if nothing else, it adds volatility. Everything could be perfectly fine, but there's like a greater chance that things could get really weird too.
If there are 2 teams that are going to test returning production's weights as far as how much defensive line matters.
Yeah.
It's one in the league we just talked about with Florida State, the loss of Jermaine Johnson, who now shout out Jermaine, looking like he might be a top 20 pick now overall, and Keir Thomas, obviously. And then Michigan, who had an even better pair of defensive ends. The system, obviously, like when you go back and you do your manual adjustments, is that a team that you say, hey, defensively, I see what the system sees here, but they were able to play a certain style that was very dependent on having like 2
and
top
Daxton
50
Hill.
NFL picks.
I kind of felt like the way that they used Hill in that defense allowed everything else to, because he's so versatile, they could be more liberal elsewhere.
Yeah, Florida State one's interesting. With Michigan, I probably wouldn't make too many manual adjustments just because, the waiting is the waiting for a reason, and what do I know? But Florida State is an interesting example of, if it really is tied to recruiting rankings and the best defensive lines are just, they always have the most talent. Florida State's an interesting one because, now that he's gone, it's not like there are 38 blue chippers waiting to step into the defensive line. Cooper was a blue chipper, but otherwise it was like low 4, high 3 stars for the most part. So if if that's why defensive line doesn't carry much weight in the formula, then yeah, Florida State's not living up to their lofty returning production rating, just because they lost more talent than they could replace up front. So we'll see. I mean, the fact that they return basically all their linebackers and all their DBs, and I still can't decide if I like Greedy Vance or not, but they added him and he's got potential at the very least. It's very easy to see why that could be a very good situation. But if Johnson really was the key, if he was just a standout talent that they can't possibly replace, then yeah, it's going to be hard. What are they were 37th on defense last year. They're projected to improve to 13th because of the returning production. That might be a little aggressive, we'll say.
Yeah, I'll be manually adjusting that slightly. Although they are really high on Jared Verse, the Albany transfer, who I think was a top 10 rated guy. But obviously FCS stats don't transfer perfectly. Bill, if we could shift over, sorry for taking this back to the ACC. I just the Michigan comment triggered my brain. I was like, that's the one I wanted to hit on about the defensive line value as far as how the returning production formula sees it. The other side of the Big Ten West, or the other side of the Big Ten, the West, is interesting here in that Iowa is like the only team that has really great returning production by P5 standards.
Mm-hmm. I assumed when I saw the production piece that Iowa would be the projected favorite in SP Plus. Then I remembered two things. Number one, SP Plus will never, ever, ever fall out of love with Wisconsin. There's nothing Wisconsin could do that SP Plus wouldn't still put them in the top 10 the next year. They've mastered it, and it's still hilarious to me that like Ken Pomeroy for so many years had the same problem with Wisconsin on the basketball side. It's like the entire athletic department has figured out the best way of saying we're not going to land a ton of blue chippers. Here's what we can land. We have a lot of very lanky athletes that sometimes we can make them 6'7", 320-pound linemen, and sometimes we can make them like 6'8", 220-pound three-point shooters. We know we can get that. We're going to build everything around what we know we can have, and that's extremely admirable. But it does feel like they're always projected higher than I want. The other thing that I wasn't necessarily taking into account with Iowa is how much SP Plus very justifiably hates their offense. They're still even with that high returning production, they're still projected only 26th. And they're third on defense and 74th on offense. It's they insist on running the ball even though they can't. They don't, even though Ferentz isn't actually all that bad on like fourth downs and whatnot. It's lowest common denominator stuff, and they're not very good at it. And if they don't have a plus 15 or whatever turnover margin, they're going to go 8-4. And so I was a little surprised by that until I thought a little harder about it. But the division as a whole really is interesting. You've got number 10 Wisconsin, you've got 19 Minnesota, who really should be could continue to improve defensively and might get things back on track a little bit offensively with Ibrahim coming back. You've got Purdue at 27th. You've got Nebraska at 34th. No comment on Nebraska's game management issues and whether that improves, but that's 5 teams within about 6 points of each other. So that's pretty big. Even if Illinois really does fall off the map I didn't realize until I was putting things together how much they lose from last year. That's going to be a real test in the second year. Even if Illinois doesn't get it together, even if Northwestern doesn't get it together, it could still be a really, really interesting race.
Minnesota almost backdoored its way into the Big Ten championship game with like 4 quarterbacks, no offensive coordinator, and a different scheme every single week. Yeah. It was bananas.
Yeah, no, that sneaked up on me a little bit until they really kind of handled Wisconsin. And I mean, like, I'm looking at their schedule again. Like, it was only 2 weeks earlier that they had lost, or 3 weeks earlier that they had lost to Illinois. So it's not like it was a massive sustained turnaround, but they really did seem to figure out a lot, especially on defense last year. And if the offense just gets back, even if it's not like the Kirk Soraka peak where they were like 10th in whatever year that was, 2018 or whatever, 2019, I guess.
Yeah.
Even if they're just like a top 40 offense again, that's a really strong team. So should be fun. Even though Wisconsin is at the top, it does bear mentioning that, number 34, Nebraska is only 6 points away from them right now. That's not very much.
All right, so we had all the comments from Lincoln Riley yesterday on how he didn't take players from Oklahoma. He took players from the transfer portal, and, legalese aside, you would think that Oklahoma would rank poorly in the returning production numbers. But actually, Bill, it's everybody else who had a surprisingly decent season in the Big 12, or or at least a good season, who is who rank 90th or worse in returning production this year.
Yeah, I mean, Oklahoma's not great. They're 71st. They're right in the middle where it's not really an advantage or a disadvantage. But yeah, I mean, Oklahoma State, you kind of knew that one was going to be an issue just with what they lost. I mean, it doesn't even count losing your stud defensive coordinator, but basically losing your top 2 linebackers and most of your secondary. And the secondary was so good. And that linebacking core never missed a tackle. That is going to be big, even though they return a lot up front. Again, SP Plus doesn't really care if you return a good defensive lineman. It cares a lot more about the other positions. And so that's gonna hurt. They're projected to fall from 4th to 21st on defense, which is still, I mean, not terrible, but it is a fall. The offense is not really projected to get better. So that doesn't seem like a great recipe for another top 10 finish. But the other interesting one is Baylor. And this is another thing where it's just, how returning production is measured. Because you look at the secondary, they lose like 4 of their top 5 DBs. Another awesome secondary. They lose a ton of important guys. They lose 4 of their top 5 receiver targets, including Ebner. That seems very problematic from a formula standpoint. They also, Bohannon's not amazing, but they return experience at quarterback, and they're going to have the best offensive and defensive line in the Big 12. They just are. Connor Galvin, I had to check 4 times. Like, are you sure he's coming back? And maybe I just searched for it wrong. Like, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. An All-American 6'7", 310 left tackle who didn't go pro, but it appears he's coming back. And like 4 starters are overall. Their defensive line is good, and just added Jackson Player, who I love. Just a bowling ball, just an awesome presence, and I hope that translates really well in the Big 12. Like, that seems like a top 15, close to top 15 team to me, even with the turnover receiver and DB, but the formula is not going to like that very much.
Is there like a player development edge that you see at Baylor, like with your eyes?
Right.
Do you see that program is in a place where whether it is like a returning production or an experience or the recruiting ratings that they have things moving in the right direction based on coaching, strength, conditioning, development, things like that?
It's quite possible. I mean, obviously both lines took a big step forward this year. They were also experienced, and they're going to be more experienced this year. And next year, they're not going to be experienced at all. And so, we'll see how much of a difference that makes. But yeah, I mean, it certainly seems like, well, number one, it seems like if you hired Grimes as your offensive coordinator, you're going to get a lot meaner on offense. More
the line is going to be nasty. Like, isn't that sort of like one of the places Grimes came from was as a line coach? Right.
Yeah, and I mean, Abram Smith obviously is a lovely and extremely physical back as well. So he had what he needed to make an immediate impact. Over time, we'll see if they, I know some of those guys were Matt Rule recruits, and we'll see if they can maintain that with their own recruiting, but. I mean, it's certainly the identity's in place. That's a big part of it. Obviously, Aranda knows what a good defense looks like. He's been a part of plenty of them. And so it seems like that's all pointed in a direction he wants it to go. As far as development goes, we just have to see them do it again and again and again before we can know for sure, I guess. By the way, one more thing about production in the Big 12. Iowa State loses everybody. Mm-hmm. It feels like that window's closed for a couple of years. Not to say Campbell can't do it again, but this was a humongous opportunity for them this year, and they lost a ton of close games, and it's going to be really hard for them to challenge again, I think, this year.
I might be buying low. Like, if the narrative gets just totally out there,
sure.
I might buy low on them. Like,
sure. Like, as a contender, I don't see them as a contender. They're not going to go 2-10, but I don't see them as a contender.
When did Matt Campbell get that contract extension? It was this year, right?
Probably. I mean,
timing on that.
He might do it again. It's just that's always going to be a program where it's going to be really hard to maintain a certain standard without an occasional fallback here.
One of the worst I told you so's was how hard the Cover 3 podcast went on cautioning Iowa State fans from their optimism. Yeah. I mean, Iowa State fans hated us. And then again, it is a painful I told you so when they don't make it to the Big 12 championship game.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you hate you never feel good about it. It's not like you're oh, they're going to be terrible and it's going to be hilarious or anything. Well, actually, I don't know. Maybe you said that, but
No, we don't. I always
Not
think
that
that's
level.
hilarious. I mean, hilariously bad. It involves, things that are much more wild, over the top, normally an explosive offense or a leaky defense. Like being very, very solid at the core elements of football is not hilarious.
Yeah, I mean, but Iowa State, like they were still 19th in SP Plus last year. That wasn't as good as expected, but it was still quite good. They just, they lose by 10 to Iowa because of a ton of turnovers. They lose by 2, they lose by 7, they lose by 3, they lose by 7, they lose by 7. It was just, they were so close to being the team they could have been, but now they lose everybody and it's going to take a little while.
I think one of the issues was you would give them a compliment by any like rational standards based on 120 years of their football program's experience, right? Like I think they can be a top 30 level team or a top 25 level team, which at Iowa State is a huge accomplishment. And they would just go nuts on you on social media.
Yeah.
Right.
No, the chips on the shoulders in the Big 12. And I'm not even going to say it's the quote unquote leftover programs. Even OU fans on Twitter have the biggest chip on their shoulder for no freaking reason whatsoever. They have been the most consistently successful program in the history of college football, pretty much, or at least the last 70 years. And they will stab you quickly. Miami fans will stab you even more quickly, but OU fans are always up there very, very, very high on the shiv list.
Oklahoma fans at least exist in real life. Miami fans are primarily like creatures of the internet. So like, I'm much more fearful of Oklahoma fans because,
Miami Twitter is so mean. It's amazing.
It is. Pac-12?
Yeah, Pac-12. I mean, I want to make sure we get to the SEC.
Yeah. All right, Bill, I have 2 Pac-12 questions.
10, 15 more minutes here. We haven't actually touched on. Yeah. Okay.
All right. USC is 94th in returning production, but they absolutely killed the portal. How?
Okay, let me pull up USC here. So obviously Caleb Williams helps, but they still only return 30% of passing yards because they lost Slovis and Dart. So that's one of those where if you're into making manual adjustments, you give Williams like a full season's worth of numbers instead of half. But I mean, even then, it's still only going to be like 50%. They return. The other offensive numbers are okay, like 50-something% of rushing yards, 60-something% of receiving yards because of the portal, because of, you lose Ingram, but you get Travis Dye, you lose Drake London, but you get Washington and Bryant, but then you also get Mario Williams and Terrell Bynum and whatnot. So that kind of on offense, it at least kind of splits the difference. Their offensive numbers aren't terrible. The defensive numbers are terrible. And that's scary because any hype they're getting this year is because of the offense. But number one, I mean, OU had its worst team in 7 years last year. And I'm not going to pretend Caleb Williams was responsible for that. He only played half the year. They still had a very, very good offense and a bad defense and now he's going to USC. It probably has less on defense than last year's OU team had. At least it will at first. Like, I really struggle with the hype here because the defense is just not built to turn around quickly. And that was USC's problem last year. That was Alex Grinch's problem last year. And now they're moving west with a roster very similar to the one they had. But the defense is where the problems are, like losing 3 of your top 5 defensive linemen and adding a couple, but not guys who played a lot, losing a couple of high volume linebackers and same deal. Like the guys they added via the portal on defense, only like one of them played more than 218 snaps last year. It's just not making much of an impact. Offense is fine. Defense is still going to be an issue.
Stanford's one of our favorite teams to talk about just because it was like the example of the early signing period and the impact that it can have and the way that admissions and all these other things that a lot of college football fans don't think about changed a program that was at the very, very top of the Pac-12 and they started to take a step back. Now we are seeing recruiting in this past cycle. David Shaw has done a really, really good job at being able to, restock everything. And here Stanford sits in a very interesting position, 3rd nationally. I think that I'm curious to hear your thoughts on whether you believe that all this seeming like reversal of the trajectory and the momentum is going to end up playing out on the field where we see Stanford back in the mix for Pac-12 titles.
Yeah, it speaks volumes. I think when I tweeted out earlier, the teams that are projected to improve the most, like on an adjusted points per game basis, not like ratings points, but actually just who's going to improve the most by points. Stanford is number one easily. They're projected to improve by 11.9 points per game overall. That moves them to 68th in SP Plus because they were 105th last year. Like well, I mean, they've had this thing going for a while now where like the offense achieves a certain level, but the defense kind of falls off a little bit, and then the defense improves and the offense falls off a little bit. But both of them completely fell apart last year. And that's like Tanner McKee, it appears to be pretty solid. His receiving core isn't amazing considering they actually have some pretty good former recruits there. The run game stunk for the most part and has stunk for years now. And they're still Stanford. They're still they want to do the big burly thing, and they have a lot of well-recruited offensive linemen, but they knew they couldn't run last year. They were like bottom percentages in like run rate and whatnot because they couldn't do it. And that's kind of crazy, but they couldn't do those Stanford things well on offense, and the defense was bad. And now they lose like the entire defensive line. Again, SP Plus doesn't really care about that, but they don't have just a ton of star talent, like recruiting stars talent at linebacker or DB. So that's kind of the issue. I think the offense should take a step forward. Tanner McKee is good, and the receiving core is very experienced. The line is very experienced. I don't know if they have a single damn thing at running back, but they should still be. Yeah, I guess EJ Smith was decent, but he also barely played. They should be okay on offense. I just don't know why. Like they get no faith whatsoever on the defensive side of the ball at this point.
10 minutes on the SEC. Can we do it?
I love that we didn't even touch on like Oregon or UCLA or Washington, but we're kind of running out of time here.
Yeah, we always do this. All right, so question for you, and this is kind of a methodology, and I'm going to tie it into the two teams that just played for the national title. Have you considered weighting returning production relative to recruiting, right? Yes. So under the theory that like Nevada and Hawaii are pretty much decimated and they don't recruit at a high level. So losing those guys who were contributors for them is a bigger deal than it is if you're a team that returns a ton of talent. Like Alabama's 65th, and that seems really high to me for Alabama. Like normally they're not 65th. Yeah. And Georgia is where Bama normally is at like 96th-ish. Does it matter, like returning production matter less if you have more freaks?
Oh yeah, and that's why recruiting is 1/5 of the formula. I have tried to play with like a weighted scale where if you return almost everybody, your recruiting rankings matter less, and if you lose almost everybody, your recruiting rankings matter more. I mean, maybe there's a good way to do it. I haven't found a way that makes it better than simply applying 20-ish% of the projections to recruiting rankings. And that basically, that pretty much solves it. I mean, Georgia is in the 90s in returning production. They're still second in SP Plus in the preseason here, and they would have been first if Ohio State hadn't been 25th in returning production. So yeah, the teams that recruit the best, it is built to give them pretty spectacular benefit of the doubt. And that's why, I included the conference averages in the SP Plus post, just like, what are the average ratings per conference? Like, all the P5 teams are projected to improve, or P5 conferences are projected to improve slightly, especially the SEC, because now A&M is recruiting like Alabama and Georgia too, and then all the G5s are projected to slide slightly for the most part. I think the AAC is experienced enough to pretty much handle that, but I mean that's kind of the way it works. Recruiting is just about giving you benefit of the doubt for the most part. It gives you more margin for error, and I think that bears out in the formula for the most part.
So Georgia being 96 does not mean that they can't win a title. Like we've seen teams close to 100 returning production win it.
Yeah. I mean, that's most of the playoff teams in a given year. This is a weird year for that, but most of the playoff teams in a given year are going to turn around and rank like 90th or worse. I think Alabama, when they fielded the greatest team of all time, potentially in 2020, they ranked like 80th in returning production. So, yeah, I mean, that's to be that good, you're going to have a lot of experienced guys who are going to turn around and go pro. And the teams that recruit at a top 5 level are going to, handle that just fine and turn around and be okay again.
when we talked about teams being like hilariously bad or hilariously good, I, laid out a little bit of a blueprint of something that I look at. I don't know if they will not be hilariously bad, but I do think that there's the potential for hilarious results with the Tennessee Volunteers, a team that ranks number 3 in offensive SP plus in the preseason, number 42 in the defense SP plus, and 9 overall. They're top 35 in terms of returning production. Where are you at with the Vols, man?
The problem with Tennessee, and I realize I could go any number of directions with that. I could go a countless number of directions with that. I know why they're there. Their offense leaped to 7th last year. Their defense was good, and then late in the year it kind of fell apart, but it still ended up top 50. Like, they improved on the field. They were, obviously they bowled, which is a little bit of a surprise from the start of the year, but they also, they lost by 7, they lost by 5, they lost by 3 in the bowl game. They were close to being a lot better than 7-6. The biggest issue is that, like, we know the Josh Heupel offense by now. Like, Bud and I used to talk a lot about covariance, just this idea that some teams will play better than average against the good teams, the worse than average against the bad, and then some will do the opposite, better than average against the bad and worse than average against the good. Tennessee is very much the latter, or Josh Heupel's offense is very much the latter. It is built to exploit whatever advantages it has, and if it has some advantages, they will score 48 points on you easily. If they don't find an advantage, there's no... It's not so sophisticated that they're going to find their way forward against Alabama, against Georgia, against the teams with top 10 defenses. And that makes them kind of hard to figure out. They only played 2 projected top 10 teams. They also played Pitt at 13th. So, Kentucky at 21st, it's not an easy schedule, but like, you can really they're going to beat Ball State. They're going to beat Akron. If Florida, I don't know about Florida. Maybe they'll be fine against Florida. They'll be favored against LSU, favored against Kentucky, Missouri, South Carolina, Vanderbilt. Like, you can easily get to 8-9 wins there, even if they can't move the ball against Alabama very well. It's just, can you play at a top 10 level or a top 7 level, I guess, or 8 or 9 or wherever they ended up? Can you? What's your ceiling when you can't really move the ball against the best defenses? Not that many can, but they, for all their prolific points and against like Missouri and whatnot, they're still going to struggle against Alabama and Georgia.
How's Missouri looking?
Fine.
Fine. We've
settled
into this comfortable place of like at least having some level of confidence that Eli Drinkwitz is going to go out there and field competitive teams, right?
Some level of confidence that the defense is going to line up in the right spot now.
We did not have that at the beginning of last year.
First half of last season, it was the strangest thing I've ever seen. Like, that, whoever was Tyon Evans, the guy who had like the 90-something yard run against them against Tennessee, like, you could tell at the snap, like, oh, there's a big wide open space right there, and he just trots through it for 91 yards. Like, they didn't blow anybody off the ball. There was just nobody lined up where they were supposed to be, and that seemed to stop over the last half of the season. So, I could spin that. Let's see, the projected 64th on defense. If they're, if the second half of the year was real, maybe they could be top 40 or 50. And now they might lose Steve Wilkes apparently to the NFL, but that's possible. On offense, they're projected 51st because they lost Bazelak, but Bazelak wasn't great. Like, Brady Cook or Horn, the incoming freshman, could match what Bazelak did. You could see a top 40 production there too, but they're projected 54th. That feels about right to me. They're going to fight for a bowl again. And in theory, maybe that changes one of these years, but they're certainly settling into a 500 or bust kind of situation right now.
Like, all right, somebody has to finish last in the West. Your numbers seem to think it will not be Mississippi State.
Yeah, it's going to be Auburn.
Yeah, well, I agree. That's actually,
I've
been looking at texts from other coaches who were like, hey, I heard. And I was like, you heard something publicly? And they're like, no. I was like, okay, well.
Yeah, who's coaching
We're all
Auburn?
thinking the same thing.
Yeah, Bill, who's coaching Auburn next year?
Jeff Grimes.
Kevin Steele. They're going to flip all the way back around, and he's going to hold
Kevin Steele just needs a nameplate that can slide into every college football office. Like, oh yeah, sorry, Mario. I'm gonna have to
40.
take this,
Kevin Steele's got like LED lights for his Zoom meetings. Like, all right, now I'm at Miami, and now I'm at Auburn.
$40 million. They're looking at $40 million in buyouts in a year and a half. Like, I just like, come on. Like that's, we're going to, as I joked on Twitter, like the Malzahn years, every single year was dramatic. Every single year was like, oh, he might get fired. Boosters might get their way. That's going to be looked back at as like just an amazingly stable time on the Plains. SP Plus says it's going to be like, what is it? Not that anybody's projected to do poorly, but LSU being last, Arkansas 6th, Auburn 5th. I figure by the time August rolls around, the portal will have made a dent in Auburn's projections a little bit further. And maybe they're projected lowest at that point. But LSU, I mean, they're 45th, well behind everybody else. And I get it. I don't necessarily agree. I mean, Brian Kelly, I don't know if he's a top 5 team coach, but he's definitely a top 15 team coach, and he'll probably get them back to that level. But I get why they would be projected in the 40s right now.
The other thing I briefly here before we finish with Ole Miss, it seems like with the early signing period, people are firing their coach earlier and earlier in the season, and there's really no way for SP Plus to be like, hey, I got to make an adjustment for this team basically quitting and playing just for themselves USC, and not one another for the last 2 months. But USC as well. Yeah, exactly. Like when I looked at the SP Plus this morning, I was like, okay, I'm going to have to manually adjust LSU and USC, even independent of the transfers, because I don't really feel like the data they gave us last year was a true indicator of their talent level and organizational level. Yeah.
I mean, LSU did it 2 years in a row, though.
That's true.
So that's true. A little, USC was decent in 2020, was projected to be like top 15 or close to it. And then because they were so horrible down the stretch, they finished 82nd. And again, that was mostly defense. The offense wasn't great, but it was still 45th. Defense was 106th. And again,
Coach got fired on September 13th. What kind of motivation are you going to have in October and November?
I mean, offense still
fired on September 13th because it's multiple touchdowns.
No, like if I was making manual adjustments, I would like change their last year's rating in the formula to 60th, 50th, maybe not 82nd. And that would probably make at least a 1 or 2 point difference in the projections this year. But I mean, again, like their offense is projected 33rd. I assume it's a top 15 offense. I assume that adjustment should be made. I don't know why I would possibly expect the defense to be better than about top 70, top 80, maybe, just because
for USC.
For USC, right. Yeah. LSU again, like I 2 years in a row is different than doing it 1 year, but USC was also way worse than them last year, I guess. Yeah, it's hard. Like this is a situation where if you're going through and you're making manual adjustments for, say, betting purposes, there are certainly, you're maybe adjusting LSU a little bit. You're probably adjusting LSU or USC quite a bit, especially on offense.
Last one, Chip.
Last one. I got to take a dog to the vet. So.
Yeah, all right, we got the portal. We got the portal king, Lane Kiffin, who is tweeting out memes, trolling Brian Kelly. And yet they've taken a ton of transfers. We've rated their transfers really highly at 24/7 Sports.
Yep.
They're 98th in returning production. Where are they still having to, like, where should Lane Kiffin go out and grab some more portal guys right now so that they can get that number up?
Yeah, if they want to game the projections, then adding another couple of receivers would be the way to go, I think. Because obviously Zach Evans, that's a pretty exciting addition. He only had 92 carries and 10 catches last year. So that only makes so much of a difference in an offense where 3 guys who had 100+ carries left. But that's where they struggled. Like obviously Jackson Dart was another situation where he's exciting, but he only threw for 1,300 yards. So they still only returned 36% quarterback production, 24% of running back production, like 40-something% of receiver production. That's where the issues are. Defense, they have issues too. But obviously the offense was why they were particularly good last year. And so that ends up being a little concerning there. I mean, we'll see. Like again, in a world of manual adjustments, I'm probably adding a couple points to their offense. But that's why they're so low. Their skill core just is gone from last year. They had to rebuild it from scratch.
He is Bill Connelly. You can follow him on Twitter at ESPN_Bill C. His returning production rankings and the preseason football, the college football SP Plus preseason projections for 2022 are out now, hot off the press, released on Tuesday and Wednesday at ESPN.com. Go and check it out. Bill, thank you very much.
See you, buddy.
Thank you.